Well, like always, it is time to check into another video. And in this video, I will be discussing a certain video made by Yagsterr. You may remember that Yagsterr made this video about why Murder Drones Episode 5 was a fundamental failure. As I mentioned in one of my previous videos, I disagree with that heavily. So I'd like to take this time to give my own little critique towards that video and explain the issues I see with the reasoning there. Anyway, I'm sorry if you could hear voices in the background again. I really suck at editing them out, and this is a kind of a public place, so others can be heard sometimes. Anyway, I just wanted to note that before we got started. One more thing I'd like to note before we get started, of course, is that I don't actually have much of a problem with Yagsterr. I don't really hate him, but I don't want any of his fans here saying that I'm just clout chasing or anything, or that my video's bad just because it criticizes him. I will say that even back in the day, he called me a murder drones expert and blatantly admitted that I was the best in that area. He called me the murder drones expert. That was a fun little comical moment, but regardless, it was admitted back there, so I don't want to hear anyone giving random complaints just because I happen to critique it. So anyway, started off, I wanted to point out some of the lesser problems I had with the video, some of the just questionable things that I think shouldn't have even been mentioned. And I'll start with the merchandise arguments. Because you see, in that video, one of his biggest criticisms was that he believes they should have used episode 5 and its introduction of Sin as an opportunity to sell a Sin plushie rather than a Crozy plushie. Which, I mean, I guess is definitely a missed opportunity. But are we serious with this? Not only does that have nothing to do with the episode itself, and it's just marketing, but also, on top of that, the same logic would make episode 3 and episode 6 bad. In episode 6, they just used a blatant rehash of existing characters and prom outfits for merchandise rather than introducing a doll plushie like they should have. Do you see anyone hating on episode 3 because of that? I thought not. Furthermore, that flaw, of course, also applies to episode 6, because simply, they did the same thing. They didn't make any merchandise for Alice or the Sentinels, but they sure did the Dog Inn plushie shortly after. Even then, they didn't, for the little, I forgot what it's called, but the thing indicating V's death, even that was about V rather than any of the new characters or things introduced in the series. It's not something unique to episode 5, and it should not be taken as a valid criticism by any means. Furthermore, I dislike the complaints about the humor. Granted, there is some humor that I just think was a little unnecessary, but it doesn't actually destroy or ruin the tension, as he says. The humor always has some kind of role it plays. Many of the scenes he's shown as examples either just weren't tense enough for it to begin with, or the joke was actually somewhat needed. Because whether you like it or not, if you just do dark, tense moments without the humor, what you get is boring. It's edgy. That it doesn't matter what kind of story or intense moments you have, if you don't have the humor to balance it out, it's just needlessly edgy and no one is going to watch. Which is a big deal that really just should not be skipped over. Really, the episode 4 was arguably a bigger example of the humor in intense moments, and yet episode 5 for some reason gets particular hate because of this. In episode 5, many of the examples they use, such as a cliffhanger ending, just blatantly aren't really, they don't really destroy the tension of the scene. The scene just isn't really that tense, or is not supposed to be. It's a common bait and switch thing. The scene seems like it'll be really tense, but then there's just something comedic to lighten it up a little bit and keep it from crossing into the territory of pure edge. And it's not like the tension in every scene with a joke suddenly disappears. There is still tension there. Unless you add a negative value, it doesn't just suddenly make everything detract. It won't detract from the existing tension just if you add something humorous. It's a good balance to keep, and that episode is probably the best balance in the series. I also have been hearing weird complaints about how they handled certain things regarding the plot, and that people say there's no progression in the episode, which I disagree heavily. For one, episode 5 just is the factual backstory episode. I don't care how you feel about flashbacks, but it definitely moves the plot forward. The characters, it's not just us that don't know their past or what happened there. They didn't know what happened there. It was something that they were in as well. They were in that same boat. That episode set up the entirety of the rest of the series, because without that knowledge, nothing would have happened. Episode 5 was needed to introduce us to the truth of what happened, as well as introduce in Uzi and V to all of that. Or, well, V still technically knew, but obviously she wasn't going to say anything. She was going to hide it forever. Because of that episode, so many grand things happened that are essential to the plot. Even just outside of what happened in the flashback and what it taught us, how the characters react to everything that happened still changes everything and pushes the story forward. The doll stole the key bug, and Uzi couldn't get it back because she was in the middle of trying to save Anne from being lobotomized. That led to episode 6. And there's the laughing in the background again, but anyway, Anne in particular survived because of this, which is yet again important, and he got his memories back, so he was able to remember Tessa. Then Uzi ended up becoming an admin and overriding Sin entirely, meaning that she was now the admin and that she was the one in control of particularly N and V. This is also very important as it directly leads to Uzi struggling with the admin permissions in episode 6 and being controlled by the absolute solver, which is going to be a giant conflict in episodes 7 and 8. On top of that, if N and Uzi didn't know about Tessa here, then in episode 6, you can bet that everything would have went wrong. Uzi hates humans. If she didn't see the flashback and know that Sin was actually responsible for everything and that Tessa was okay, then you can bet that Uzi would have killed Tessa right there. Obviously, In wouldn't have done anything about it because he was openly teaming up with her despite her hatred for humans. And, of course, if he didn't remember Tessa, then he wouldn't even have any special attachment. The entire thing was required, or else Tessa would have died there, and the plot would have never progressed. Then Jay would fight, and Jay would die as well, obviously, which would mean the series is over right there. Episode 6 was required to keep the story going and for it to make sense. God, people are being loud in the background. But I think you can kind of get the point already here. It was absolutely the most important episode so far in progressing the story. Absolutely no other episode has had something that important. And even still, every episode does still manage to at least progress the story a good bit in its own right. It's just not on the same level. It is criminal how people talk about how little it progressed the story, and yet they like episode 2. I mean, seriously, these kids make it hard to record, but I don't hate episode 2. I love episode 2, but frankly, people complain about episode 5's progression, and they like episode 2, which did pretty much nothing in the long run. All it did was teach them that the absolute solver exists, which they would have learned eventually anyway. Episode 3 progressed more than episode 2, and even then it was somewhat lackluster by comparison, because all they did was stop Doll and have Uzi consciously awaken the absolute solver for the first time, even though she's been subconsciously using it since episode 1 and her past a long time ago, back in class. The episode with the most progression is 5. Undebatably. It's just such a bad criticism that I will never understand. Furthermore, episode 5 developed the characters because, quite frankly, Sin was absolutely unknown before then. We knew nothing about her, or we didn't even know that she was under the control of the absolute solver back then. But now, perfectly do, and we can see through her actions how disturbing the absolute solver can be. And it's a good way to communicate how absolutely pure evil that thing is. It is a twisted, eldritch monster that twisted the original worker drones into disassembly drones. It ruined V's life, and we got to see what happened and how it ruined Tessa's. We saw what led to the entire planet being destroyed. This is a very big deal. We also, it's not like anything that happened in that episode wasn't foreshadowed. We did get some foreshadowing prior, which makes it much more interesting, such as how in episode 4, Uzi touched the zombie drone, not Uzi, and touched the zombie drone VHS, and of course, he saw a flashback for a brief second of Sin creating the null black hole that eventually destroyed the planet. Furthermore, I believe, if I recall correctly, he complained about the TV screen at the start that acted as minor exposition for the episode, which was about as vitally important as possible. It was literally an explanation for how the zombie drones work. It answered so many old questions, such as why N laughed a little when he got injected with a virus by J. It explained that the absolute solver manifests in damaged AI for the first time, which was later stated out loud by Tessa in episode 6. And already, it had introduced the statistics behind it. So really, if any math nerds are here, I'm sure you can actually find out a reasonable estimate about how many of these things there are. It's minor things like that, but all of it is very important. I remember him also talking about how the episode only panders to the lore experts or the people who are particularly obsessed with the lore rather than the casual audience. But the thing is, new episodes shouldn't be pandering to new members of a community. If new people join, then alright, but the audience for the show is explicitly because of the lore. All of us that have stayed here years later are here because the lore and story kept us interested. This show is lore heavy. That is simply it. Every episode has incredible lore that you can miss if you're a casual viewer. I mean, seriously, in episode 1, Uzi literally uses the absolute solver to deflect a bullet for a split frame, and then it disappears afterwards. Plus, Uzi's absolute solver symbol is set to true at the end of episode 1, which was also in a split-second moment. Plus, Sin and Tessa were both foreshadowed in episode 1, as well as yet another mention of the absolute solver, all showing up in the same scene. Every episode has these lore moments. It's not a criticism for episode 5 that it does the same thing. Really, in the end, the criticisms given to it just don't make sense. I'm going to check the recording real quick, but I can go on here for hours if I really wanted to. Anyway, as I was saying, the entire popularity of the series is built off of the lore. Suddenly having a problem with an episode because it was mainly focused on the lore is nonsensical. There is also another criticism that I felt was absolutely unfair, was that they got mad because there was this teaser of numerous disassembly drones under the control of Sin and the absolute solver, but that they didn't play much of a role in the actual episode, and they just briefly showed up at the end. The problem with that is that not only is that not the actual episode, but surprise, surprise, that is yet again something that is not exclusive to this episode at all. Have any of you seen the promotions for episode 4? I mean, all the teasers for it just show absolutely nothing that was in it. First, there was the picture of Uzi standing on an iceberg. That never happened. Not only that, but it had nothing to do with the episode at all. It was nothing even close to that. Then there was a picture of the cabin with a glowing red light in it, which granted could be the perspective of what it looks like from outside. Wow, everything's glowing red from Uzi's absolute solver going out of control. But the door was closed at that time, so really it still isn't depicting the actual moment happening. And there's also the actual thumbnail of the episode, which is another scene that doesn't happen in the episode, which really applies to pretty much every episode. The thumbnail isn't something that actually happens in any of them. And on top of this, in the episode 4 kind of teasers, there was this art showcasing Uzi, and not really art, but there was this thing showcasing Uzi in some lake that was in an ominous lighting, which was implying that that water had something to do with Solver Uzi in that episode and the conflict. But, of course, that scene was never in the episode either. I mean, even the one we see in the kind of trailer for episode 4, I forgot what it's called, that it was the black and white one, kind of like the Blair Witch Project thing, where it was just a recording as Solver Uzi tracked down a drone outside and killed it. That one wasn't a clip from the actual episode. So, hating episode 5 because it wasn't the same as what was promoted just is not fair criticism at all. It applies to every other episode, and it's explicitly being used to target episode 5 unfairly. I wouldn't even mind if this criticism was directed at every episode, even though I personally don't see the problem. I'm just saying that it's unfair to only use it to criticize one episode. Frankly, I'd say that objectively, every episode has gotten better from the last, besides maybe episode 2. I kind of have mixed feelings on that, but definitely still underrated despite everything I've said and how I've criticized it as well here. It really, episode 5, I feel like it's objectively the second best episode here. Now, is it my favorite? Obviously not. My favorite is episode 4 and probably will always be. But it's just the simple truth. Most of this stuff does not line up with what we're actually shown to begin with. Even back in episode 4, back in its trailer, another thing that didn't line up with the actual show was this teaser of a character we haven't seen yet, where it said that Mother makes fuel from bones. We all thought that that would have some relevance in the episode, but yet again, it didn't. I've spent a lot of time on this point, but I cannot stress enough how all the logic here just can be applied to other stuff. And I'm not even saying that that message won't be important eventually. I don't doubt that character will eventually be introduced and have a big deal in the story. But I just can't see a single logical reason not to criticize episode 4 for this, but to criticize episode 5 instead. I think I'm going to end this video here, but not sure. If I decide to end this video or decide not to, then I'll return and add a few more clips. You'll see whenever you get the video. If not, then I guess the next video will come whenever I finish. If this is really it, then I guess see you. I just want to make it clear real quick. The bottom line is that Yagsterr, I don't really have a problem with him, but his video was not fair criticism, and I overall disagree due to these reasons I've stated, and feel that episode 5 is truly a masterpiece and one of the best episodes I've ever seen of anything.